were lost in a campaign. They would all pass before the emperor and place a single arrow into a basket. The arrows would be counted and the baskets sealed until the troops returned from the campaign. When the soldiers returned, they would all take one arrow from the baskets. When the last soldier took an arrow, they would count the remaining arrows so they'd know how many men were lost. The number of aircraft destroyed during WWII is greater than the number of aircraft that currently exist in the entire world today. I think he's right. Agree to the Telegraph, there are around 40,000 commercial planes. Even if you had the non-commercial planes, it's still inferior to the loss of 300,000 planes during the WW2. Edit. Grammar. I don't know my irregular verbs. John O'Neill worked for the FBI pursuing Al-Qaeda, trying to convince higher-ups to take the threat more seriously. He was eventually pushed into early retirement because his personality clashed with FBI leadership. And he went on to head security in the World Trade Towers, where he was held 1 month later in the 9/11 attacks. Edit. I highly recommend watching The Looming Tower. During the Cold War, Denmark had an interesting way to catch spies. They'd ask you to pronounce Rødmedfjeld, which is a well-known dessert in Denmark. But it's hard to pronounce if you're not Danish, which made spies easy to catch. Try listening to it on Google Translate. Edit. Wow. I typed this before going to bed yesterday, and I woke up with 20k upvotes and a Reddit gold. Wow. Thanks, Alet. Romans really loved their dogs. So much so that people made graves for them. Some of the writings on the grave said things like, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands 15 years ago. I found it interesting and very sad." Rhode Island declared independence from Britain on the 4th of May, 1776. 2 full months before the rest of the colonies, and were promptly forgotten about. I love en masse, and every time I meet someone from RI I realize I've completely forgotten it exists. Albert Einstein was offered the role of becoming Israel's second president in 1952, but declined the offer. Worth noting that President of Israel is more like Queen of England than President of the US. They have a prime minister who is elected and runs the government. It's not like they were just, "Hey, that Einstein guy is pretty smart, let's let him run Israel." Well, more archaeological than historical. But this is the internet and you can't stop me. The Hagia Sophia, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, has some odd scratches inside. For hundreds of years, no one knew what they were, so they left them. It was eventually discovered that they are Futhark runes. Some Norseman far from home, possibly a member of the Varangian Guard, left a message for us, successfully screaming it across 1,000 years by carving it into the one building he knew would never be knocked down. Hafton was here. Johnny Cash was in the Air Force in 1953, intercepting and translating radio signals from the Soviet Union. He was the first American to learn of Joseph Stalin's death. An American lawyer invaded Nicaragua in 1856 and ruled for just under a year until the neighboring countries teamed up and kicked him out. The best part is that he wasn't finished after that. He tried starting other Confederate slave republics in Central America. Winston Churchill ordered an attack on the French Navy to prevent its ships from falling into North Sea hands. The French Navy was considered one of the most modern of the world and a real threat to the British Navy. That's the real forgotten historical fact. Narrator. Had the Germans come by sea, the French would have triumphed. Unfortunately, the Germans had tanks. Lots of tanks. The first exoplanet, planet beyond our solar system, was only discovered in the 1990s. I remember all those Time Kids magazines and stuff. Is Planet X real? Evidence of a new planet. One of the survivors of the sinking of Titanic, Violet Jessup, also survived the bombing of its sister ship Britannic and the ramming of its other sister ship Olympic. She's the only survivor of a disaster on all 3 Olympic-class ocean liners. She lived to be 83. She was the real unsinkable. You'd think she would stop going on ships after the second time or something. During the sinking of Britannic, she used her experience from Titanic to tell the other nurses to put their life belts on under their coats, so that if they ended up in the water and needed to ditch their coats they could. The Battle of Siragari. In 1897 India, 21 Sikh soldiers in an outpost were confronted by 10,000 Pashtun soldier army. The 21 Sikh held off the army for over 7 hours and killed over 600 before losing the post and their lives. Held off long enough for word to get back home and an army to militarize and come recapture the post. Only time in British military history that all men involved in a battle were awarded the highest medal available to them. The Romans had a lot of festivals, and there was this special one which only women were allowed to attend. Men attending witnessing the festival in any way, or even saying the name of the goddess, was a crime. One nobleman named Clodius Pulcher decided he wanted to seduce the woman hosting the festival, and sneaked in disguised as a woman. Apparently, a slave girl started chatting with him, and when he responded, the slave freaked out because of the deep voice, and got him arrested. He stood trial on pain of death, but won, mainly with bribery. This same dude was accused of incest with his sister. Got himself adopted, at age 34, into the lower class just so he could run for an office. Got Cicero exiled from Rome, and was an all-around mad lad. Got to love the late Republic. Benjamin Franklin was such a proponent to enemas that he had them several times a day, but only to be administered by young female attendants. The American military has not made a single Purple Heart medal since WW2. The reason being they made a lot in preparation for a ground invasion of Japan. Incorrect. While the US has not yet issued all the Purple Hearts made for the invasion of Japan. At one point a ton of them got administratively lost. So the US made some more because we were running out. Then they found them again. A suffragette tried to blow up Robert Burns' birthplace. Up until 1966. There used to be a type of coach that would get uncoupled from a train while the train was in motion and use its brake to stop at a station. This was to allow express trains to carry passengers destined for smaller stops without stopping. A smear the anti-Caesarians used against Julius Caesar was that he was a bottom. It certainly wasn't a smear to say a Roman nobleman ducked men. It was not only accepted but expected. But being a bottom was seen as immoral and subservient to lesser. Abraham Lincoln was a champion wrestler, with only one loss in his career. There was a bear, Corporal Wojtek, in Polish military during the Second World War. He was good to people but would take part in actions, like carrying ammunition and such. He smoked, ate cigarettes and drank vodka. After the war he was kept in a zoo and his old companions would go into his habitat and wrestle hug with him. He is an actual idol in Poland. The ancient Assyrians were absolutely brutal in their dealings with subservient nations as they were building their empire. To the point where the Persians, especially Cyrus the Great, banked on the fact that they weren't as terrible and much more lenient than the Assyrians. The USA and Canada provided the Anglo-American loan, with interest, in 1946 to help the UK rebuild after WW2. It was only finally repaid in 2006. Germany only finished paying reparations for WW1 in 2010. There are still ongoing negotiations and debate regarding Germany's WW2 reparations. In 1910 they tried to get approval to import hippos into Louisiana and set them free in the bayous to help with an invasive plant species problem and to provide a source of meat during a national shortage. In another fun twist, the bill was lobbied by two spies who were supposed to assassinate each other. I think people in Louisiana dodged a bullet. Just imagine invasive hippos, the deadliest animals in Africa, rampaging around the state. Also, could you please give more info about this spy vs spy thing? Sounds like a fascinating story. Charlie Chaplin outlived Elvis Presley. So what? I've outlived both of them. The Mormons fought a war against Missouri in 1838. The governor of the time signed Executive Order 44, which basically said they were to be driven from the state or killed. That didn't get rescinded until 1976 and apparently never had a challenge to its legality. When the Apollo 11 moon lander left the moon, it knocked over the flag. Source: youtube.com. Also, because of all the solar radiation on the moon, all the flags are now plain white. Vikings settled in North America around 500 years before Columbus hit the West Indies. One of their largest villages was in Newfoundland. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the 70s. I still hear people saying yeah, but that hasn't been confirmed. Totally has. For some time. The Etruscans made beer in very large ceramic pots. The pots were semi-porous, allowing it to evaporate and cool the contents. Then they hung long reed straws into the pots to drink from. 3,000 years ago these guys were drinking cold beer from a straw. What you call a chandelier today was nearly called an electrolier, but the word never caught on, so chandelier continued to be the word used in everyday life for a suspended light fixture, even though they no longer contain candles. In 897, Pope Stephen VII had the body of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, dug up and put on trial for perjury and illegal papacy. The body was propped up on a throne during the trial, and after being found guilty, Stephen cut off 3 fingers from the corpse, the 3 fingers used for blessing. The Civil War started in Wilmer McLean's backyard in Manassas, VA. He didn't want anything to do with the war and moved to Appomattox, Virginia, where the Civil War ended, in his kitchen. When the HMS Hood was destroyed in its battle against the Bismarck during World War I, only 3 sailors out of 1,418 survived. That's a casualty percentage of 99.8%. When the Bismarck was taken down, only 114 sailors out of 2,065 survived. The HMS Dorsetshire took in 111, but after a U-boat siren they didn't want to have the same fate as the Bismarck. AU-74 came back the following morning and rescued 3 sailors. When 8 of the British soldiers who committed the Boston Massacre in 1770 were put on trial, their defense lawyer was John Adams. He got 6 of them acquitted. Operation Vegetarian. A British military plan in 1942 to disseminate linseed cakes infected with anthrax spores onto the fields of Germany. These cakes would have been eaten by the cattle, which would then be consumed by the civilian population, causing the deaths of millions of German citizens. Furthermore, it would have wiped out the majority of Germany's cattle, creating a massive food shortage for the rest of the population that remained uninfected. The cakes themselves were tested on Grenade Island, just off the coast of Scotland. Because of the widespread contamination from the anthrax spores, the land remained quarantined until 1990, plus 40 years. In March of 1907, Congress passed the Expatriation Act, which decreed, among other things, that US women who married non-citizens were no longer Americans. If their husband later became a naturalized citizen, they could go through the naturalization process to regain citizenship. But none of these rules applied to American men when they chose a spouse. The death toll from the bombing of Hiroshima would not have been nearly as high if the Japanese had not sounded a premature all clear. The people had gone to shelter when a B-29 assigned to take weather readings for the attack was spotted as it flew over the city. When nothing further happened, they sounded an all clear, and people emerged from their bomb shelters just before the atomic bomb was dropped. In the 1800s there was a solar flare so strong that it made telegram wires start on fire. It was called the Carrington event. The scariest part of that is that we're overdue for another flare of that intensity. Imagine what it would do to our technology now. Opposite Waltham Village Hall in Liverpool, where Paul McCartney first met John Lennon, there is a graveyard. Eleanor Rigby is written on one of the old gravestones. People assume that Paul got the title from that grave for his song, but in actual fact it's just an amazing coincidence. Back in the day of the plague, people understood that if you survived the disease you were far less likely to get sick again. It wasn't until several hundred years later that Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who were exposed to cowpox were immune to smallpox. A serious problem at the time. He exposed a boy with a strain of cowpox and noticed that he was immune to smallpox too. This process of exposing an individual to a pathogen to build up immunity was known as variolation. So I was incorrect. Jenner termed this process vaccination, which was later improved upon by Louis Pasteur. Jenner isn't credited with inventing vaccination. Inarguably one of the most important medical advancements, despite what many medical professionals with minutes of medical training on the internet may tell you. Hiroo Noda, a Japanese army intelligence officer, spent 30 years hiding in the Philippine jungle because he refused to believe WWII had ended. He was talked into leaving in 1974. More men were executed for witchcraft in the medieval period than women, and the church spent more time condemning witch hunts than supporting them. The Ottoman Emperor wanted to send £10,000 to Ireland for aid during the 1840 Irish potato famine. Queen Victoria intervened and requested he send only £1,000 as she had paid £2,000. He did that, but also sent 5 ships of food and were one of the only countries to help the Irish during the famine. Edit. Empire to Emperor. America used the Cherokee language as a secret language in WW2 because nobody in the world but Americans knew it at the time. I always found the story of Roanoke, aka the Lost Colony, to be really interesting. Yet I've hardly ever met anyone who knows about it, other than the people I went to school with when we learned about it. Russia had a nuclear disaster, Kyshtym disaster, back in 1957. More than 20,000 square miles, 52,000 kilometers too, where at least 270,000 people lived, was contaminated, and they covered it up. The CIA found out about it by 1960 but kept quiet about it as America was trying to promote nuclear energy. The world heard about it in 1976. Peru declared war to Germany and Japan a few months before WWII ended. They did it only because that would allow them to be admitted as a founder member of the UN. Charles II of Spain was so horribly inbred that if his parents were siblings he would be less inbred than what his family tree, it looks like an upside down pyramid, did to stay in power. He ended up horribly developmentally challenged and was so ugly he scared his wife. His autopsy is amazing and a great read. Poor guy. Cuchulainn, a female descendant of Genghis Khan, said that the man who wanted to marry her would have to beat her in a wrestling match. They never did. But instead, she won 10,000 horses over the years. I believe she won the horses through the fights. If her suitor couldn't beat her, they had to pay up in the form of horses. So 10,000 horses means a lot of fights. The King of Siam offered Abraham Lincoln 50 elephants on the grounds that a country as great as the United States should not be without elephants.